obviously, I've always believed that we need to bring all disciplines together, through curation. I think, curating for me, as J.G. Ballard once told me, is junction making. So we make junctions between artworks in an exhibition, but also junction between the disciplines, junctions, of course, not only between works of art and disciplines, but also junctions between people. So it's all about junction making. And so in that sense, for me, kind of basically as a teenager growing up in Switzerland, I read Vasari. And of course in Vasari, the lives of the architects and the lives of the artists are together. So I always believe that exhibitions give this possibility and this opportunity to actually bring things together, because as Etel Adnan, the Lebanese poet and artist who actually also was an architect, she designed amazing house projects, but she always said, she didn't have the opportunity because of the circumstances, because in the 40s, 50s, for her, it wasn't possible as a woman to be an architect, she said, but also it wasn't possible because of the civil war later on to be an architect. So it remained unrealized. And Etel Adnan's beautiful house, which now, in collaboration actually with her partner Simon Fattal, we realized in Lebanon. Etel passed away last year, Etel Adnan, age 97. Etel really gave the motto for this pavilion, and she said, the world needs togetherness, not separation. The world needs love, not suspicion, and the world needs a common future and not isolation. And so in a way, I would say this idea of togetherness, of a common future, is something why we believe that art and architecture should be together. And of course, early on, the reflection at the Serpentine was how could one exhibit architecture? And it all began in 2000 when Zaha Hadid and our former director Julia Peyton-Johnson, our former chairman Laura Palumbo, were actually working on this very first pavilion here. And out of that, grew the Serpentine Pavilion. And the Serpentine Pavilion, of course, is the idea of exhibiting architecture by building it. I think the best way to exhibit architecture is not through maquettes, because if you exhibit maquettes and models, somebody who is not necessarily in the architecture world, somebody who is not familiar with reading plans and models, we never make the experience. You can somehow imagine it, but it's not. And we want, similarly with art, with art, the artwork is the experience. It's not about representation, you experience the artwork. And so we want people to experience architecture and a maximum number of people to experience architecture. This is why we are not putting it behind a closed door. As you can see here, people just walk in, and we have, several hundred thousand visitors for this scheme, and that means obviously it's, besides the Venice Architecture Biennale, one of the most visited architecture exhibition, in the world, and I would say that is very much what we believe we can do with architecture. Of course, the other thing, as a curator, which I always believed in, is that we can involve architects in exhibition design. The idea that we basically, have an exhibition design where the architects develop a display feature, because as Richard Hamilton always pointed out, we remember foremost exhibitions which also come up with an experimental new display feature, and that display feature can be created by an artist, but can also be created by an architect. And so that, I would say, are the two possibilities. So it's built reality through pavilions, or it's built reality through exhibition design. And of course, in both cases, it's very important to think about the environmental impact, to think about sustainability. Here, not only it's about using sustainable materials, like Lina foremost used timber here, different forms of timber. She also used very thin, layers of timber. So it was also the idea of using a minimum of material. And of course, the pavilion always has a second life, so that in that sense, it's basically always rebuilt and will then be installed somewhere else, permanently. And of course, the same thing is true for exhibition designs. It's very important that recycling and upcycling is used. So for our current exhibition of Thomas Saraceno, which you see in the gallery, and Thomas, of course, Thomas Saraceno was my student when I used to teach art in Venice, and for me, being a professor in Venice in 2000, 2002, I felt, why would I teach art and not combine it with architecture? So we teamed up with Stefano Boeri, the well-known Italian urbanist and architect whom you know, and also very important Stefano in relation to the environmental aspect of architecture, with the way he brings trees into many of his buildings, and forests. His buildings are forests. And at the same time, Stefano is also the president of the Triennale of Milano, and together with Stefano, he and I run a seminar where we combined art and architecture. So his students of architecture and my students of art were following the same classes, and at the end of the day, they did the exhibition together, and we formed teams. We always have an artist and an architect, forming a team. And it's Thomas Saraceno, who exhibits now in the gallery, was our student. So he comes from an art and architecture background. joined the gallery in 2006, we worked with him and with Cecil Balmont. Rem spent decades here, coming from the AA, lived here, and had never built here. So in a way, the context here, as much as London is a truly global city, the architectural sort of discourse, but particularly not so much the discourse, the architectural practice of actually built reality was always quite insular. And so we wanted with this scheme to open it up by inviting these architects. And then of course about 10 years ago, we started to more and more go into a younger generation. And that's something we particularly reinforced, I would say, in the last 4 or 5 years, to go into a younger generation, to also make the whole program much more diverse. And that's something, we can see, for example, in the work with Francis Queré, who of course went on shortly after the Serpentine Pavilion to win the Pritzker Prize. We saw it with Frida Escobedo, who at the time when we invited Frida to build the pavilion, had not built a lot outside Mexico, and now just won the commission to design the new Metropolitan Museum, the new wing for the Metropolitan Museum in New York. You can see it with Sumaya Bali, the youngest architect from South Africa. Actually, Sumaya is based in London, but also in Johannesburg. She was in her late 20s when we appointed her, had done amazing experimental temporary structures, exhibitions, but never really built in that sense. She created this amazing structure here of an archipelago. For the first time, the pavilion went into many different neighborhoods, and she now went on to win a very important competition last week in Belgium to design a bridge. So this idea that also, we want this to be useful, right? And I think everything we do, and I mean that's another premise of curation. It's not only about actually making junctions, but it's also about it being useful for the public, it being useful for all Londoners and all visitors to London, inclusive and useful, and at the same time also it being useful for the architects. And if we can, as it seems to for a younger generation of architects, help to change that trajectory, to open up and produce reality, that obviously makes us very happy. And we're also deeply grateful to David Adjaye, who is one of the main advisors to the scheme. And of course, it's also thanks to David and his amazing collaboration with him in terms of him, mentoring younger architects, but also, of course, him being so helpful in terms of making it possible for them, to build in London, because very often these younger architects don't have an office in London. They don't have, big offices have offices everywhere. But for these younger architects, it's so important to have a kind of a possibility of having a pied-à-terre à London, thanks to David. So we are very grateful to him, because also really through this dialogue with him, it became possible for us to work with a younger generation. Yeah, I mean that's a very interesting question also, because we think that part of the Serpentine Pavilion is also that it's an environment which is not necessarily prescriptive, but that it's somehow an environment where people can invent their own use. And I think it's interesting if you look at pioneering inspirations for that. I mean Cedric Price, the late Cedric Price, who of course together with John Littlewood came up with this idea of the Fan Palace. John came from street theatre, and they wanted to build a Fan Palace which would be an interdisciplinary kind of organization which is completely flexible, and the use of what it's used for could be reinvented every day, which would also be very open to the street, no doors. I think that sort of notion of indeterminacy of Cedric, but also of having this possibility to actually be a magnet. Cedric often said that, and these pavilions can be very much a magnet to kind of, revitalize also, because very often when they go after this to another park, they create a new life, or they can go into a city center like the Tsu Fujimoto one with the Luma Foundation, which is in the center of Tirana and is really functioning there like a magnet. So Cedric's indeterminacy, the idea of pavilions, or structures being magnets, I think is important. It's also interesting to think about, I've done long interviews with the legendary architect Doshi over the last couple of years, which are now going to come out as a book. And Mr. Doshi's focus also on this idea that there are so many different ways how we can use a house, or a building. He did this beautiful book with my friend Dayanita Singh, the photographer. It's one of the great architecture books of the last, I would say, 20 years. It's one of my favorite architecture books, because Dayanita and Doshi talk about this way of how a house can be used in so many different ways, and that actually the use of it can be permanently reinvented, and there's also generosity is involved. There is a generosity, and I think in a way that's what we try to have with the pavilion. Because it's open from early morning hours to late evening hours, and people can always reinvent the way they're using it. I mean, Lena was mentioning this morning that she hopes that children are going to run around. I also saw already. I already predict in a way lots of things we can't predict because there's an indeterminacy in it. So there's always a surprising use. So we see lots of surprising things happening here. One thing which I predict is also that the joggers are going to run circles here. Because we always have the joggers coming in early in the morning. Of course, there's going to be lots of use also of this center space, which is almost like a stage. So you can imagine. I mean, we are here not far away from Speaker's Corner, right? And we could imagine that this becomes also a place of impromptu performances. And actually, I wanted to find this very beautiful quote here from her, which I had this morning, which I wanted to read for you, which is, I think this idea of nature has been very important for us because we worked here at the Serpentine a lot with Gustav Metzger 15 years ago, the late Gustav Metzger, another inspiration, who said, that our task is to remind people of the richness and complexity in nature, to protect nature as far as we can, and by doing so, art and architecture will enter new territories that are inherently creative, that are primarily for the good of the universe. And of course, Lena, growing up in Lebanon, in Beirut, during a civil war, was always very touched by nature, by the capacity of nature to bring us beauty. And of course, for her, as a child growing up in Beirut, she saw basically nature growing out of the ruins. And I think out of that grew her dream to be an architect. For her, architecture, as she told me, was a way to dream about a way of bringing people together, of bringing beauty. She said, I always very much needed beauty and dreamt about making beautiful things. And she also says architecture has the capacity to heal a landscape, to heal society, and to bring people together. And that brings us back to Etel Adnan and her beautiful quote.